Hi, and welcome to Chronically, formerly known as Concussion Talk Podcast. My name is Lauren Zayaks,
I'm Nick Mercer.
and we're teaming up to talk about all things chronic illness. We'll still be talking about chronic concussion, but we're going to follow a lot of other journeys along the way. So make sure to subscribe and check back in. Thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Welcome back to Concussion Talk Podcast. I'm Nick Mercer. It's been a long time, and I'm now with Lauren Zayaks, who will tell you about this new podcast we're doing.
Yeah, thanks. It's so exciting to be back. We're going to be reframing our podcast to Chronically, formerly Concussion Talk Podcast. And we're doing that intentionally because we want to be able to expand to other topics that also impact people with concussion and chronic illnesses. There's so many shared intervention techniques. There's so many, or treatments, there's so many shared comorbid conditions or conditions that occur together. And so we wanted to be able to talk to you about all the different aspects that might be impacting you during your concussion recovery or during your journey in chronic illness. So it's really exciting to be here after a long break. I'm pumped to be back with Nick again and bringing you all these great experts from really across the globe, because it's Canada and America, and who knows where else we'll get guests from.
Exactly, that's great. Yeah. So, I mean, we've done a bunch of podcasts and learning, and like, but yeah, it was on. You did a lot on there's a whole bunch of it you did on 3PD POTS, 3PD, which is business, POTS, which is, don't tell me, it's just, I know it's tachycardia, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, and we did, actually, we're going to talk about today, we're going to do a brief intro into your new one, not new one, but our new podcast will be on, we'll start with dysautonomia, but first, I guess I'll just reintroduce myself to people who may not have heard of Concussion Talk podcast, because I don't know why you're listening to this podcast now if you haven't heard of that, but there it is. So, but yeah, I'm Nick Mercer. I was doing Concussion Talk podcast for, I guess you can say, since 2015. I think you can say I owned the blog Concussion Talk since 2010, and we started the podcast in 2015. And I've taken over a year and a half break since I did my last podcast, and now I'll be back with my great friend Lauren, who has been a star on my great friend, because we never actually met in person. But
We can still be friends in
well, we
today's
can still
world.
be friends. So be it by distance. But yeah. But you were on the podcast. I don't know how many countless times. I I think we counted it was 14, 17 episodes, and like of Peace and Concussion podcast, and then like more, and you're on the Concussion Talk podcast, of which I've done 165 episodes, and plus I've done other podcasts between, and my I mean, so in total on Concussion Talk podcast, the feed you'll find, and the YouTube channel you'll find over 300 episodes. So you can tell us in your Instagram page, which is at Lauren's at L, what's your Instagram page is
It's at L Zayaks,
at L
Ziaks.
ZIA, or Z, as they say in the USA in the States.
Yeah.
ZIAKLZIAKS. And
So
for
was
Canada, it's
the
LZIAKS.
yeah. So is
But
the question sort of like, what is dysautonomia?
yeah, so yes,
Okay, yeah.
about that now. The question. So what is dysautonomia?
Yeah, so dysautonomia is a chronic condition. So it's not just that I'm dehydrated because I didn't drink enough water today, right? But it's a chronic condition that can happen because of an illness or an infection or an injury. And in young people and teenagers, it can have what's called insidious onset. It can just come from nowhere. But for those of us who are older, there's usually a triggering event. They believe it's an autoimmune disorder, but they don't know what the gene is yet, so the jury's still out on that one. If it is an autoimmune disorder, that would make a lot of sense, given that it's triggered by other events, just like other autoimmune disorders are. We tend to have multiple types of injuries or types of illnesses together. Like I have celiac disease, which is also a genetic condition. So it's this genetic issue that kind of comes in buckets with other chronic illnesses. It's triggered by another event, and it's a dysregulation of your autonomic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system is your fight or flight and your rest and digest, to like way oversimplify it. And so those two systems become dysregulated, and that causes widespread problems throughout your body. Any questions there?
So that'll be so more like I didn't read the second, Lauren. I gotta read the thing now.
Yeah, so your
Okay.
so your fight or flight system is your sort of being excited, what I need to run from a bear, but also like what I need to feel happy or feel aroused. So the fight or flight, the sympathetic drive is not bad, right? It's just bad to be stuck in your sympathetic drive. So that kind of sympathetic overload, adrenal fatigue, like you might hear those kind of buzzwords. And your parasympathetic nervous system or your vagus nerve, as everyone's kind of talking about right now, is that
Yeah.
rest and digest. So that's where I go into that calming state where my organs get all of the oxygen and the blood flow that they need. So it's not bad to go into the sympathetic drive, but we don't want to be stuck there. You want to be able to flex back and forth between the two, and you want to spend more time in your parasympathetic drive. And so for patients with dysautonomia, that homeostasis, that balance is fundamentally disrupted, and that causes downstream effects to your other organs, primarily your blood flow system, right? Your blood pressure and your heart rate.
Okay, right. So that's kind of what we'll be talking about throughout the whole this well not randomly, I shouldn't say that, but in different points of our journey as chronically podcast together. But Brady, you can tell us just rudimentary about what has changed over time, the understanding of that of dysautonomia, what teased our audiences, what is left to know, and maybe just has you've experienced dysautonomia from your multiple concussions you've had. So what does that feel like? I guess to start off with,
Yeah.
what does
Okay.
symptoms feel like?
I was gonna say that's like four different questions at once.
Yeah, so
So
I try to
what
amalgamate. I'm impatient.
what
Just
what it
nothing else.
feels like is this chronic fatigue, right? So doing daily tasks becomes harder and harder over time because being upright and moving around is hard for us. And the reason
Yeah,
why being upright is so hard is because the system that controls your blood pressure and your heart rate, and therefore the blood flow to your brain, isn't working properly. And so when we are standing for periods of time, gravity causes the blood to pool into our legs, and we have
ah,
less currency to go to our brain. So if we're sitting or lying down, we'll feel better. And if we're standing up and moving around, we'll feel worse. And
that explains
as
a lot of
you
my
can't
guess.
tolerate exercise, you become deconditioned. And the more deconditioned you become, the worse the disease become or the disorder becomes, because now like sitting upright might be hard, and so patients end up in bed more, and that further deconditions them. So it becomes this really vicious cycle where maybe your symptoms are more mild and people might shy away from getting treatment. They feel like, oh, I don't deserve to take up space here because my symptoms are mild. But no, like that's when we want to see you. Because we don't want
Yeah,
you to become the person who can't get out of bed, right? We want to see you when it's more mild so that we can easily address these problems instead of having to tackle these really big hurdles.
yeah, that's kind of like because when I multiple times I've talked to you in the past, well, I guess the past few 10 years, but or 8 years, I guess. Um, yeah. You've been on the treadmill walking, so you do that to stay operating condition, then obviously you operate for your job. But like that is definitely a helps you a lot get back to your get improve your homeostasis and your overall conditioning.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
yeah,
treatment for dysautonomia is mostly non-pharmacological, meaning mostly
yeah,
non-drugs. So people
that's
will be
good.
prescribed medications like beta blockers or blood pressure medications, but really that just helps you function or masks symptoms. But what actually treats us is finding a way to do symptom-guided activity, and that might be 2 minutes of leg slides, right? I started with
Yeah,
5 minute intervals on a recumbent bike, and that was all I could do. We didn't have the Adapt back then. We were still
yeah,
creating it at the time. But so I started in that preconditioning stage, and I went from being a runner to 5 minutes on a reclined bike was the maximum that I could do, and it was exhausting, right? And then you build up over time, and it took me a long time to build back up. I had been deconditioned for 12 years by the time I got my diagnosis. So I was really
yeah.
sick by the time I got to that starting point of my journey. And now I'm able to walk. I'm not really able to run very much. I kind of go through fits and spurts where I'm able to tolerate running. But right now I have to walk. And if I don't walk for more than 2 days in a row, my symptoms start to come back. So you have to maintain that exercise, but that's not unique. The cardiovascular system, the heart pump system is not favorable to anyone, right? If a big runner doesn't run for a week, they're going to feel bad when they get
Yeah.
back into that first run, right? We just, with dysautonomia, I specifically have POTS, which is one of 15 types of dysautonomia. But we tend to be more vulnerable to deconditioning than the neurotypical population. And that's where that really short window of forgiveness starts to come from. So I have to prioritize cardio in order to keep my autonomic tone conditioned so that I can stay upright. And autonomic tone, to really to boil it down and oversimplify it, in your blood vessels, you have what's called smooth muscle. That's very different than your skeletal muscle for like your biceps, right? You have this special type of muscle. It also lives inside your gut. It's what controls the motility or the movement through your gut. And this smooth muscle tone is controlled by your autonomic nervous system. And so a big part of our exercise is that we're actually maintaining that smooth muscle tone, which keeps us upright against gravity.
Well, that's because I mean, those symptoms you mentioned of dysautonomia, although I was never diagnosed with it because I just had a severe brain injury, so I was in a coma. I just figured everything that happened to me was just because, well, I was in a coma and my brain was hurt. But which if it's is, I guess, generally just basically the case. But that's the symptoms you described with dysautonomia are very similar. Like much more comfortable lying down or sitting down. Well, even sitting down, I feel my legs getting a bit like it's usually chairs aren't just for just maybe my size. Maybe I don't find chairs that comfortable, but yeah, I find that in standing again, I just my legs are tired. But as you said, it's because the blood pulls your legs, and it doesn't. It's not as efficient getting to your brain. Although I don't really find that as much now. It's been 20 plus years since my injury, so but those symptoms are just whether you have diagnosis on them or not. Those symptoms are something that everyone with a brain injury or concussion, well, I don't know if concussion necessarily, but brain injury at least, will definitely recognize. So, and you mentioned did you want to say something?
Yeah, so you actually said something really interesting there, incidentally. So yes, those are symptoms acutely post head injury, right? So
Yeah,
early on post head injury, when you have the chemical storm that's going on and the byproduct in your brain, we know that there is an early on autonomic dysregulation that occurs. That's where that
yeah,
research comes from in concussion on the importance of exercise, because
yes,
symptom guided exercise early on helps correct for that dysregulation in your brain. And a part of the autonomic nervous system is something called cerebral autoregulation. So what that means is how the blood moves through your brain. So if I'm doing a thinking task or a planning task, parts of my brain should light up. They should get more blood flow because they're in demand. And
Right.
after a brain injury, it's hard for us to do that skill set, right? It's hard for us to move that blood to and through different areas of our brain. And that will correct itself over time with symptom guided exercise and just with healing. Now, in dysautonomia, this is the chronic form. And so, just prior to the pandemic, we were learning that people with chronic symptoms that look like concussion symptoms, but they also look like dysautonomia symptoms, brain fog, fatigue, headaches, dizziness, vision
Hmm.
problems, thinking problems, mood regulation, sleep regulation.
Yeah.
Most of those patients actually can qualify for a type of dysautonomia, usually something called orthostatic intolerance. And so, what we started to learn pre pandemic was that a lot of these patients, like you and me, who were attributing our symptoms to concussion or brain injury, actually had underlying dysautonomia, which is treatable, which we can manage and we can make go
Yeah.
into remission and we can improve those people's quality of life. But 20 years ago, they didn't know that. 10 years
No.
ago, they didn't know that. It was only just starting to get a little bit of airtime pre-pandemic. And then in long COVID, approximately 74% of patients with long COVID symptoms will have a type of dysautonomia. And so then all of a sudden, and with social media, everybody started to talk about it.
Wow. So yes, we will get into long COVID as well because that's very interesting. I've heard from other physios. Brett did a podcast when I was doing Concussion Talk podcast. Did one with a physio at Mount Sio who is big into long COVID recovery as well. So but yeah,
Yeah, so I mean, the long COVID overlap with concussion is really interesting, like how similar the treatments are, how similar the symptoms are. So I definitely want to make sure that we talk about that in a future podcast.
and we will, no doubt. But you mentioned the symptoms, so not the symptoms and the treatments. So, but just what are first of all, what are just common symptoms? Someone says, "Oh, yeah, I recognize that," or and treatments for not the symptoms, but treatments for dysautonomia as a whole.
Yeah, so the symptoms again are going to be those symptoms that are very similar to concussion. So brain fog, fatigue. The fatigue is different though than being tired. It's this
Yeah,
profound, it can be almost a flu-like type fatigue, this pervasive all of the time tiredness. It can also only occur after exercise. So there's this really interesting group of people who are a little bit more mild where they feel better during exercise, but then after exercise, all of their symptoms start, their headaches, their dizziness, their fatigue. And that group tends to fit into our bucket in the dysautonomia world. It might be that they have GI problems, they have temperature regulation issues, they may have chronic widespread pain. So their body is not regulating itself properly. And so the symptoms can be all over the map. And a lot of them look like concussion symptoms. It's just that they are chronic and they are worse with activity. And that activity could be something like showering. So I might have a patient that says, I get really fatigued after a shower. Well, why? Because they're standing in a hot environment in one place. And so the
yeah,
act of actually showering challenges their nervous system in a way that we take for granted. And then that's a huge part about this illness is it's things that we take for granted. Standing in the kitchen to empty the dishwasher might make you dizzy because you are turning your head, but
yeah.
also standing to chop your vegetables, right? You're still standing for both tasks. And so we start to get kind of confused about what's actually causing this problem. Like, why am I so tired? Why can't I follow a recipe when I've been standing for a period of time? And it's because I've been upright. So that's kind of the hallmark of dysautonomia versus an acute and early on head injury, TBI or mild TBI concussion.
Right.
And then for
So
treatment was your other question?
yeah, just
Okay.
I was going to make sure you got there.
Okay.
Treatment
So the
for
treatment, again, there's medications, but the medications are going to treat symptoms. So they might be really important to help you access the medicine, which is exercise, right? But the treatments are learning how to pace. So first and foremost, things that cause flares, especially if you have post-exertional malaise, which is profound fatigue that feels almost flu-like, and it's caused by physical, mental, or cognitive or emotional, physical, mental, or emotional challenges. Um, if we have those conditions and we trigger more fatigue, just like in brain injury, we create a world where we cannot improve. right? So after your brain injury, they want to push you to a point of some symptoms because that forces change. But if you then have to go home and take a nap for an hour or it ruins the rest of your day, you did too much in therapy and you made it harder for your brain to recover. Those same rules apply to patients with dysautonomia. If I'm doing too much upright activity, if I end up in bed for a day, I've actually created an energy deficit that makes it impossible for me to recover. So the number one treatment is learning how to pace, learning how to listen to your body, modifying activities to make them less challenging.
That's
The
a
number
tough one.
it's I mean like we could
Learning
do
to listen to
entire
your
podcasts
body.
on human
Yeah,
behavior. Yeah. Yeah.
totally.
And then number two is volume expansion therapy. So adding salt and water so that you increase the blood volume available in your body so you have more to go to your brain. Number three is compression for the patients where it's appropriate, and that just pushes the blood back to your brain until you get strong enough to do it yourself. And then, of course, number four, the most important treatment is symptom guided exercise. And exercise becomes an inflammatory word in this space, but exercise is whatever is available to you. So, again, if it's 2 minutes of wall slides, that's your exercise. If it's a 20-minute
What are
walk,
wall slides? What are
you put
wall
your legs
slides?
up on the wall and you literally
Okay.
slide your legs on the wall. It's terrible and tedious, but a very important part of the process
Okay.
because there's no resistance to blood flow to your brain if you're laying flat. So you have room to exert yourself to start to exercise.
Yeah.
But exercise increases our blood volume, it regulates that autonomic tone, it increases our muscle strength, our cardiovascular health. So, the number one treatment for dysautonomia when they do these really short term studies, 6 month follow ups is the best that we've got right now. If we are able to exercise at appropriate volumes, we actually will no longer test positive on an upright test. So, the way we put this disease, this disorder into remission is by exercising. And the whole goal is how do I make exercise accessible to each and every person, no matter where they're at, so that they can access their medicine?
Right. Well, no, that's important because having access to exercise, whether it's walking or treadmill or well, treadmill is walking, but or running, but just just doing anything, just moving your body and just being not necessarily active. Well, active, yes, but like not necessarily hardcore active. Not like when you think of like, oh, you're an active person. You think of someone who's a mountain climber or a marathon runner or something like that. But just to be move and move consciously and move and just do it with intent. And well, intent is in this case is to improve your dysautonomia symptoms or your concussion symptoms. So we will definitely talk about that more as for different, not just dysautonomia, but for anything to do with concussion or exercise is good for any condition, any chronic illness or condition that you may find yourself in. But to back to dysautonomia now, what is it? Lauren, could you just recap the important points? So I guess those important points is a bit tough because they're all important. But I mean the
Can I
take home
wrap it up?
message from
Yeah.
well, yeah, in a nice way.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know.
yeah.
I meant to say it nicely. So I meant to say wrap it up, but yeah, but yeah, just get to it.
Yeah, yeah.
No, yeah,
And something I want to talk about in the future, you actually were just alluding to physical activity versus cardiovascular exercise, right? So
yeah.
we definitely want to talk about that because physical activity is not enough, and that takes up a lot of our currency away from our capacity to exercise. Exercise is a sustained activity over time, which has different magic in your system than physical activity. Physical activity is also important, but when we're talking about exercise for dysautonomia, it's actually sustained activity. And so I definitely want to talk about that in the future.
Okay, well,
For
actually,
our,
I'll just interrupt you for a second there.
yeah,
Shout out to our local is in Newfoundland, St. John's, Newfoundland. Michelle Plowman, who has done a lot of work and she's working jointly with other physicians across Canada about cardiovascular activities or cardiovascular exercise during after a stroke or for patients with MS. So yeah, so sorry, Lauren, I just wanted to make sure that both recognize that's something that's been talked about here as well. So yes,
yeah.
get back to this.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, so dysautonomia is a condition that's usually triggered by something else. Concussion is actually a major triggering event for dysautonomia. We know that there is dysregulation of that system early on after a brain injury. Usually it gets better, but when the symptoms last for more than 3 months and we start to get into those chronic concussion or persistent post-concussion symptoms, is the new term versus post-concussion syndrome. When we start to
Yeah,
get into that bucket, these symptoms actually look very much the same. And so making sure that you see a provider who is aware of dysautonomia and is able to test for it, something we'll talk about in the future, then you can start to get access to the right treatment. And so for Nick and I, we both attributed some of these symptoms to our brain injuries because nobody knew any better. But actually, there were additionally treatable conditions underneath, at least for me, where things that I had kind of just chalked up to I'd had too many head injuries and it was as good as it was going to get.
yeah,
Actually, there was an entire treatment bucket available that completely opened up my life in a really exciting way. And so being aware of this diagnosis, knowing what the symptoms are, and then being able to access treatment, this is a manageable condition. So I think that's the biggest piece. And it requires a lot of difficult human behavior changes, pacing, drinking nasty salts, wearing compression, and exercise, which are all very challenging things for humans to do. And then we will talk through ways to start to tackle those health behaviors and how to make them ingrained behaviors in you so that you can have access to your medicine throughout the rest of your lifetime. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm super excited to go back to collaborating with you again.
yeah. That is going to be very exciting. And I was going to say, Lawrence, I don't think you and I are just ahead of the game because we both had our brain injuries before all this newfangled research was out there. So yeah, so this is gonna be exciting new chapter, journey, whatever podcast. I mean, call what you want, but yeah, there's so much more to discuss too. There's different, not just this time is very important to concussion sufferers, but also it's a ton of different chronic illnesses that we want to breach as well. And I just hit the limit of my screen there. So anyway, that's taken care of now. But yeah, I would like to cause actually, Lauren, during your discussion about Tassan being smooth muscle and GI dysregulation, um, that's something. It's an area of the body I want to talk about because I don't know if I haven't had a podcast about it before, but I know it's important that I had cancer in 2017, 2018. I had chemotherapy, and well, 2017 slash 2018 I had chemotherapy. I was diagnosed. Well, I'm I guess well, the doctors don't like to say in remission because don't just say that you've overcome it because you never overcome it, but it's it's taken care of. It's well in hand now. So I've been that I'm being checked and stuff. So, but yeah, but I have a good friend who is also an oncologist and someone who's did a PhD in Lynch syndrome, which is what was the genetic cause of my colon cancer, which what people will go into more in the following in future episodes. So but yeah, that's just one example of something that both area that we'll discuss, but we'll discuss others as well as they come up. So and more about concussion and brain injury. This is that Lynch syndrome was a slight departure from this, but yeah, but it's the same chronic illnesses and chronic conditions brought on by brain injury or something that I think are very exciting, but very important to discuss and get people aware of. So thank you, Lauren, and look forward to doing this more often. So we'll be discussing more. And thank you all for listening. And I don't know how many people are listening to the first one, but it's an important one. So hopefully you'll go back and listen to this first one. And yeah, so thank you. And you know, before we sign off, really, Concussion Talk is on Instagram, Facebook. It was on Twitter, but now it's Action. I've kind of departed from that and just it's a year and a half off, kind of let that go. But it's on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, obviously. Um, so it can, at Concussion Talk is for all of it. So for Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, at Concussion Talk, one word. And Lauren, you wanted to you had your own also your own Instagram feed where you're doing some education about dysautonomia and other conditions
Yeah, so
on your
you can
own.
find me at L Ziyax, and I also have a Substack at Dr. Ziyax. So happy to connect with you in any way, and thank you for taking the time to listen. We'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye.